Continuing to look at some of the things that have inspired me in creating my San Francisco and Northwestern Pacific layout, I thought we might take a look at San Francisco's Ferry Building. The Ferry Building at the foot of Market Street has stood for over 100 years and is one of the city's most famous landmarks. Designed by A. Page Brown in 1892 and completed in 1898, its history is a most important part of the city's story. With San Francisco being located on the end of a 40-mile-long peninsula, the Pacific Ocean being on one side and San Francisco Bay on the other, fleets of ferry boats were necessary to get across the bay to Oakland and Berkeley to the east and Sausalito to the north, before the Golden Gate and Bay Bridges were built in the 1930s. Even following the opening of these two great bridges, the ferries continued for several more years to ply the waters of the bay, offering a water crossing to passengers and autos alike. Indeed, a trip on one of Southern Pacific's many trains to the east would, for someone in the city, start with a ferry crossing from the ferry building across the bay to the Oakland Mole, where the traveler would board their train. A favorite story of mine was told to me by an uncle of mine. As a young man, he came out west on the train from Missouri. He disembarked from his train at the Oakland Mole, and seeking some directions as he got off his train, he asked someone there which way it was to Market Street. "Oh, you're headed into San Francisco. Well, you get on that boat over there at the end of the pier, and it'll take you the rest of the way." My uncle replied rather nervously, "I didn't know you had to take an ocean voyage." As passengers and commuters got off the ferry, many would continue their trips by catching one of the nearby streetcars. At one time, Market Street had 4 sets of tracks, carrying the cars of both the Market Street Railway as well as those of the Municipal Railway. These cars would loop in front of the ferry building. One can easily imagine how busy and congested the area could be at rush hour. In 1917, a pedestrian overpass was built across the Embarcadero, allowing pedestrians to avoid all the streetcar traffic as well as the trains of the California State Belt Railroad that passed directly in front of the ferry building. It remained until the early years of World War II, when it was torn down to help supply material for the war effort. The pedestrian overpass was quite the necessary thing when the Beltline would pull as many as 60 cars down the Embarcadero. Running in the open street, the trains did not move fast at all, so this could be quite the impediment for pedestrians. The State Belt Railroad was owned by the state of California and operated by the State Board of Harbor Commissioners for most of its life. It served the piers and businesses along San Francisco's Embarcadero, as well as reaching Fort Mason and the Presidio of the U.S. Army. Several yards along the Embarcadero would hold cars of various railroads. The belt interchanged with the Southern Pacific on the eastern side of town, and interchanged with the Santa Fe and Western Pacific via car float operations. Bill and Michelle Kaufman have produced an excellent book covering the State Belt entitled The State Belt, San Francisco's Waterfront Railroad. It is most thorough in its coverage of the road and its history. I very highly recommend it. It's superb. The ferry building sits just across the Embarcadero from Southern Pacific's headquarters building at 65 Market Street. Started in 1916, it was completed in 1917 at a cost of $1.5 million. At that time, it was the largest steel frame building west of the Mississippi. It would be sold in 1998 by SP's successor, the Union Pacific Railroad, for $50 million. I suppose just another bitter footnote in SP's history. For many years, General Petroleum advertised mobile gas with a very large sign atop a building at the foot of Market Street. It could be seen for blocks up San Francisco's Market Street. Below, however, we still observe the many PCC and older streetcars, as well as a Marmon-Harrington trolleybus that all forsake internal combustion in favor of electric power. Coming into view at the bottom left is a Powell Street cable car about to take the turntable. When modeling San Francisco, one would be totally remiss without including this icon of the city. While its location here at Market and Drum Streets is about 9 blocks further down Market from its terminal at Powell, I had to include it as well. So whereas this used to be the actual end of the line for the double-ended California Street cable car, I've chosen to install a turntable for the Powell car here now. Here we see an inbound Powell Street car, just a block or two from its turntable at Market Street. And after having been swung around on their turntable, the Powell Street cars will run outbound on 2 different lines from downtown. After cresting Nob Hill, their routes diverge from Jackson Street onto either Mason Street or Hyde Street, and then go on to the northern edge of town, terminating at Fisherman's Wharf and Ghirardelli Square. Coasting onto its turntable here in 1959, passengers will both hop off and hop on in somewhat of a frenzied musical chair routine. On the left is an important monument just across the street from the famous Palace Hotel. It is Lotta's Fountain. Bequeathed to the city by the famous actress Lotta Crabtree, it was unveiled in 1875 on the 25th anniversary of California's admission into the Union. Originally, the fountain was not as tall as in this picture. In 1917, its height was extended to have it comparable with new light standards which were being installed on Market Street. In 1998, due to some damage, it was restored to its lower original height. I include it here because it has always been a special landmark for San Franciscans. Each year following the great 1906 earthquake and fire, survivors of the event have gathered here at the fountain in remembrance of that fateful day, April 18th. Though there are no longer any living survivors left to join in the ceremony, many people still assemble there each year to remember that tragic day. San Francisco's Market Street was so named by Jasper O'Farrell in 1847. O'Farrell's designs laid out Market Street to run diagonally to the streets north of it. He borrowed the name from Philadelphia's Market Street, but designed the width of San Francisco's boulevard to be 120 feet, 20 feet wider than that found of its namesake. The great width of San Francisco's Market Street allowed, for many years, room enough for 4 separate streetcar tracks, referred by locals as the Roar of the Four. A privately owned enterprise, the Market Street Railway, with its white-front cars, traveled on the inside tracks, as the cars of San Francisco's Municipal Railway ran on the outer tracks. Waiting to board a Market Street white-front car could be a harrowing experience, I'm quite sure. The Ferry Building would be witness to many events in the city's history and would face several challenges of her own over the years. Her first real threat came when, being just 8 years old, the great earthquake and fire of 1906 befell the city. While she escaped the wrath of the tremor for the most part, she saw the fire come right to her doorstep. She would survive the day, as 2 fireboats and 2 engines would be there to pump salt water from the bay. Her survival was most important in the following days, as she continued to serve in her role, providing many a means of leaving the destruction that had befallen them. The earthquake came in the early hours of April 18th at 5:12 a.m. However, the hands of her clock, running a bit fast, would stop at 5:16. There they would remain for a year. She had suffered some damage to her clock tower in the earthquake. Although the steel framework remained undamaged, the Calusa stone on the walls of her tower had suffered some damage and would be replaced with concrete. A second threat would come in the late 1950s. With the bridges having been built, the bay ferries were no longer needed. At least such was the case in 1958, as we saw the last of the ferry service come to an end that year. I suppose that quite a few people probably wondered what would happen to the ferry building without the ferry boats. But now, seemingly without purpose, it seemed to be just another office building, although the clock tower would still stand tall. I don't know, I was too young to know, I guess, but most evidently, its elegance must have been taken for granted, now that its purpose had gone away along with those of the ferries. At any rate, the ferry building would now see a different kind of threat in 1958. With the momentum of interstate highways being constructed, I suppose someone thought it would be a great idea to build more freeways here in the city so we could move around more quickly in our cars. One of these great ideas, a freeway which would become the Embarcadero Freeway, California's Highway 480, would help speed autos and trucks further into the city as they came off the Bay Bridge. This new freeway would pass directly in front of the ferry building. And so as not to interfere with the activity on the city streets, it would be an elevated, 2-level affair. Great plans were to have it extend between the Bay Bridge all the way to the Golden Gate Bridge on the other side of town. The post-war era was full of many ideas, crisscrossing town with new roads and transit boulevards. I can only be thankful that most of these ideas never saw the light of day. But the Embarcadero Freeway did come into existence. And while it might have been a boost for North Beach and Chinatown, it came with a cost. Our beloved ferry building would be lost behind this ignoble, ugly affair. The freeway just seemed to cut through so many of the city's relationships. What was an intimate arrangement between the magnificent Southern Pacific building and the ferry building was now separated by a nasty fence between the two neighbors. I suppose we could be glad that this hellish project did not continue on any farther than it did, being abruptly ended at the foot of Broadway on the Embarcadero. I can only think of 2 good things about this freeway. The first is that just before it had been completed, it served as the setting for a terrific movie ending. A movie called The Lineup closed with a car chase where the bad guy drives up onto the new roadway. Realizing at the very last moment that he was about to drive off the end of the unfinished upper deck, he hits the brakes, skids into a U-turn, and tries again to elude the police who are in hot pursuit. But of course, as happens to all bad guys, he reverses direction and takes another wrong turn, finding himself running into another part of the road that has been closed off. In desperation, he gets out, takes aim at his pursuers, with the ferry building in the distance bearing witness to the scene. Catching up to the bad guy, the police take aim, and, well, with nowhere to run, now, the second good thing about the Embarcadero Freeway, in 1989, we had one of our, what can I call it, little shakes. Most of you refer to them as earthquakes. While the Embarcadero Freeway did not come down as the Cypress Freeway did in the East Bay, it did take a beating, and it was very substantial. Here you see the temporary supports that were installed to keep it from crashing down following its fatal damage. In its present condition, then, it was indeed a most substantial hazard, and this wasn't just my opinion. So, the only thing that could be done was done. And I would agree, I do believe that's a smile on the clock face of our old girl. So, after having been masked by this atrocious and completely unfashionable piece of attire for 31 years, we could once again see her in all of her grand elegance. Needless to say, try as you might, you will not see any part of the Embarcadero Freeway on the San Francisco and Northwestern Pacific. So thanks so much for looking in. I hope you've enjoyed it.